What are you doing? New Year's Eve. Well, if you're here this evening, that means that you are celebrating New Year's Eve with me. And we are listening to Tuesday Tales of Terror. I am your host, Collie Mortwood, and I'm going to guide you through another terrible tale. I don't care where you're going or where you're not going, heading out or staying in. You always sparkle on New Year's Eve. So we got a little glitter going. We got the sparkly snowflake earrings. We got a sequin top. We are here for it. And I've got an exciting tale to tell. Once again, we're reading from the Christmas and Other Horrors Anthology, edited by Ellen Datlow. And I did tell you that they have a lot of stories that are centered around the holiday season, specifically around the solstice. They did have some that are into January. I skimmed through a lot of them. I did not find a New Year's specific one, unfortunately. But I do have some exciting news. The story that I did find is based out of Salzburg, Austria, which means that I get to butcher a German accent for you tonight. And I'm so excited. So, without further ado, let's jump in. This evening's story is The Importance of a Tidy Home by Christopher Golden. If anyone had told Freddy he would one day be elbow deep in a garbage bin behind a third-rate restaurant in Salzburg, searching for a late dinner, he would have scoffed at them. Haughtily, of course, the way professors are meant to scoff. That had been his occupation, both vocation and avocation, until 1957, when addiction to morphine had led first to petty crimes and then to a psychiatric hospital. This was before Austria had begun to approach drug addiction as a problem requiring treatment instead of punishment, and so there had been a bit of time in prison as well. Prison had helped. Freddy knew that wasn't the case for many who had been in his position, but for him, prison had been a time of clarity. Without drugs, without alcohol, and without distraction, he had learned that the mania he had always experienced, the way his skull felt like a hive of agitated bees, could be survived. And if that meant he sometimes saw things that weren't there, or said things that others interpreted as either a bit mad or wildly inappropriate, well, that was the eccentricity of a professor. Of course, once he had been released, no one wanted him as a professor anymore, or anything else for that matter. By that night, the 5th of January, 1973, he had been living without a home for 9 years, during which time he had never diluted his brain with a single ounce of alcohol, nor the use of any illegal substance. But since the polite society of his city had finished with him, Freddy had finished with it. He lived in its parks and haunted its alleys. He accepted the offerings of strangers but never met their eyes. He forged a life from their cast-offs, from food and clothing discarded and forgotten, just as he had been. The first time he saw the Schnabelperchten walking the streets in their black robes with their gleaming shears and their enormous bone-like beaks protruding from beneath their hoods, it did not surprise him that they passed him by. Their duties could not bring them to his doorstep, because of course he had none. No threshold, no door, no visitors, nowhere to mark the start of a new year, only the continued existence of life invisible, a creature unseen, quiet, even when loud. The Schnabelperchten were even quieter. Tonight he and his friend Bern were out together in search of food. Freddy had forgotten the date until he spotted the creatures. It was the 4th January 5th he had seen them, and each time they had ignored him. He had presumed they appeared every year, and that he had slept through their arrival in the years that he had missed them. He watched as they crept along the streets, leaving no trace of their passage through the lightly fallen snow. They were delicate creatures, some with their brooms and others with their shears, and no door was ever locked to them. Every home opened, no matter how tightly it had been shut up for the evening. Shh, 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 they whispered in the hush of the falling snow, and they went about their business. Freddy climbed down from the side of the garbage bin, holding the bag of leftovers he had known he would find there. The kitchen staff always wrapped the food being discarded and placed it in a single bag along with the uneaten bread. The restaurant manager frowned upon this practice and had shouted at his employees for encouraging nightly visits from the homeless, but they were kind and waited until he was out of the kitchen before putting out their bag. This place was no Gablebrau, but the staff there had never been so kind, and even if they had been, Freddy did not like roving around that part of the city late at night. Here there were more homes, lived in by people who desired quiet evenings away from the downtown. A clang of metal echoed along the alley. Bern had let the garbage bin's cover come crashing down. Freddy glanced anxiously around, afraid they would draw unwanted attention. If they created any nuisance, their lives would become more difficult. Sometimes he grew frustrated with Bern for his clumsiness, although never for his addiction. Alcoholism made Bern a fool, but it was the engine that drove him, as much a part of him as his left leg. Hush, Freddy said in German, more a plea than an admonition. Don't be a fool. Bern did not so much as look at him. Thin and gray, unshaven and unkempt, and in an ill-fitting suit that did nothing to disguise the state of his dissolution, he staggered from behind the bin to stand next to Freddy. Don't you see them? He whispered. Freddy glanced from the alley into the street again. The Schnabelperchten were still passing by, spread out like a hunting party, perhaps 20 feet separating each from the next, some on one side of the street and some on the other. The most fascinating thing about them was the size of their beaks, at least 18 inches in length, but wide enough that if one could draw back their hoods, the creatures would not have any face at all, or so it seemed. Only beak, the gray-white of bone. The first time he had seen them, 9 years ago, Freddy had been reminded of old photos of plague doctors, but these were not masks, nor did they have anything like goggles to resemble eyes. They glided along the road. Even as he looked, he saw one approach a door that led to a stairwell rising to the apartment above the flower shop across the street. Silently, Freddy hoped the owners of the shop kept a tidy home. Freddy, Bern rasped, shaking him by the shoulder. Don't you see them? Hush! Of course I see them. Are they ghosts? Bern whispered. They don't look like ghosts. They seem solid enough. Are they demons? Freddy pondered that. Honestly, I'm not really sure what they are. Though they are certainly not people. They are Schnabelperchten. The word caused Bern to screw up his face in a way that made him look like a toddler given an unfamiliar vegetable for the first time. I don't understand. You just said they're not people, not human. Aren't you frightened? Acid burned in Freddy's gut. His laugh was bitter. Of the Schnabelperchten? Certainly not. You and I have nothing to fear. But what are they? Bern prodded. Freddy gazed at him, trying to not let his friend see the flicker of distaste that passed through him. I forget sometimes that you are not from Salzburg. What has that got to do with anything? If you were a child here, you would know the story, Freddy replied. He patted Bern's back. Come with me. His friend hesitated, but when Freddy began to walk along the alley, Bern followed. Most of the Schnabelperchten had already passed by, but there were a few stragglers who had gone into the homes along the street and now only emerged. Without eyes, it was difficult to know for certain whether the Schnabelperchten noticed them, but they showed no interest. They might as well have been dust motes in the air or dry leaves that skittered along the road. Do they not see us? Bern asked. They are like most of the people in this city. We are invisible to them, he replied. One of the Schnabelperchten passed, and in the light of a street lamp they could see blood on the blades of its shears, dripping onto the street. When Bern saw that blood, he looked as if he might be sick. Come, Freddy said. Those two. He pointed at a pair of creatures further up the block. They approached the door of a two-story home. Bern followed anxiously as Freddy crept up behind the two beaked inspectors. One of them extended a skinny hand with long fingers like the legs of spiders and turned the doorknob. It ought to have been locked, and Freddy believed that if he or Bern had tried the knob, it would not have turned. But for the inspectors, no door was ever locked. They opened the door and stepped across the threshold. Freddy caught the door before the Schnabelperchten could close it. He heard Bern suck in a terrified breath behind him. But the inspector who had tried to shut the door just left it and began to move through the house. "I followed them before," Freddy whispered, worried more about disturbing the family living in the home than drawing the attention of the creatures. Inside, the inspectors began to move about the place, spidery fingers gliding along tabletops in search of dust, beaks lowering to discover if the floors had been swept or vacuumed. "Chee, chee, chee," they said quietly, without mouths. One in the kitchen brought its head down close to the stove and seemed to study its surface for much too long, perhaps deliberating on its relative cleanliness. "Ugh!" Freddy leaned over to whisper into Bern's ear. His friend was trembling. "It is the Epiphany," he said. "Christmas ends tonight. January 1st begins the calendar year, but tonight is truly the beginning of the new year. The Schnabelperchten bring happiness and blessings for the coming year, but only to those who are properly prepared for the new beginning, who have set their houses in order." What happens if they enter a home that has not been tidied in anticipation of the new year?" Bern whispered. Bern watched intently as one of the inspectors went up the stairs, shears hung at its side. Freddy understood his fear, even found it somewhat delicious, but Bern was his friend, and he knew there was cruelty in allowing him to continue in ignorance. "Something horrible," Freddy said. He took his friend by the wrist and shook it, forcing Bern to look at him. "But we have no home. They are not here for us. Do you see?" At last Bern seemed to exhale. Moments later, the inspector who had gone to the second floor returned, its shears still clean. It joined its fellow Schnabelperchten, and the creatures walked right past Freddy and Bern and out the door. This time it was Bern who led the pursuit of them. Out on the street again, the breeze was chilly enough to remind them that they were alive. Snow fell gently, a hush that felt like it made some sound just beyond the limit of their hearing, though it was only silence. In morbid fascination they followed the two creatures, while other Schnabelperchten drifted along the street around them, wordless and intent, moving amongst them, ignored as if invisible. Long after midnight and in the quiet hush of gently falling snow, they might as well have been wandering the street inside some Christmas snow globe. "What are they?" Bern wondered aloud. "Spirits," Freddy replied. It was the only word that felt acceptable. He had so many questions, but no real answers. The Schnabelperchten came out one night a year, which meant every other night they were somewhere else. If he could ask them anything, it would be about that. Schnabelperchten glided silently from building to building. Up along the road, Freddy saw others crawling on the outside of several taller buildings, cloaks billowing in the breeze as they slid open windows that should have been locked. One perched at the edge of a rooftop, scuttled to a domed skylight, opened it, and vanished within, its beak leading the way. Somewhere Freddy heard a baby crying. The infant's wail pierced the oh-so-silent night, and then abruptly ceased. He pressed his eyes tightly shut, forcing himself not to imagine the things his darker fears wanted him to imagine. They reached the house where the two Schnabelperchten they were following had gone inside. Bern turned the knob and the door opened. It had unlocked for the inspectors and remained unlocked, at least until the creatures departed. Bern did not hesitate now. He stepped over the threshold as if he had forgotten Freddy entirely, too curious, too eager. Suddenly this felt too intimate. They were intruding on this quiet moment, this breath taken and held until sunrise, when the new year would really begin in earnest. He had a spot behind an old crumbling school building where heat vented from the inside created a small bubble of warmth near the dumpster. The roof's overhang kept the elements off his head except on the worst nights, and he wanted to go back there now, to his spot. Bern, he rasped, trying to grab his friend by the back of his coat. But Bern had passed through the home's little entryway, where coats hung haphazardly on metal hooks. Too many coats, too few hooks, and 3 pairs of winter boots were arranged along the wall, not impeccably neat, but he thought they would pass inspection. Then he followed Bern into the living room, and he froze. Antlers hung from the wall above the fireplace. The room held an eclectic array of furniture, most of it threadbare and in mismatched floral patterns. A small black and white television stood on a tray table beside a fat armchair. Magazines were strewn across the coffee table and piled beside the armchair. An open box of biscuits sat amongst the magazines. A coffee cup and a plate of crumbs and grape stems had been abandoned there. The entire room needed to be straightened, vacuumed, dusted, but the worst of it was the stink of cat urine and the litter box in the far corner. Oh no. In front of an overstuffed bookshelf that looked as if the books had been stacked and piled by an angry drunk. Across the room, through an arched entryway that led into the hall, Freddy saw the 2 Schnabelperchten return from the kitchen and start up the stairs. Bern padded across the stained carpet to follow. Freddy urged him. He lunged to grab his arm. Don't be a fool. Bern turned to glare at him. They can't see us. We should not intrude, Freddy said. When Bern ignored him, Freddy grabbed him again. You don't want to see this. Bern scowled, shook himself loose, and darted for the steps before Freddy could try to drag him from the house. Freddy cursed under his breath and followed. He reached for Bern's coat a 3rd time, but the other man was younger, quicker, and reached the 2nd floor before Freddy could catch up to him. The top step might as well have been a brick wall. This was as far as Freddy was willing to go. On that last step, he watched as Bern slunk along the corridor and peered into one room, then moved on to the next. Before he reached that room, the noises began. From the room at the end of the hall came a sound that Freddy had heard once before in his life and far too often in his nightmares. The sound of shears plunging into flesh, a wet, violent puncture, and then the hushed metal clack of the shears being used. Ugh! Bern reached the door from which the noises emanated. Freddy had warned him, had as much as told him without telling him, but the fool had needed to see for himself. Grim fascination, perhaps, or pure sadism, Freddy didn't think it mattered which. In that bedroom doorway, Bern stood with his eyes widening and let out a scream of horror. Freddy knew he should run, but his feet moved him in the wrong direction, toward his friend instead of away. He rushed up behind Bern and clamped a hand over his mouth. It muffled the scream, and a second later Bern went silent, perhaps realizing how foolish he'd been. Quickly, Freddy whispered in his ear. Let's go! Bern whimpered but did not move. Freddy nearly dragged him, but in glancing up at his friend, he had a view over Bern's shoulder and into the bedroom. One of the Schnabelperchten straddled the woman on the bed, using its shears to open her from groin to breastbone. The whole room was in disarray, clothes piled everywhere, plates and cups on the nightstands. On the floor, the 2nd inspector knelt beside the corpse of the husband. His guts had been laid open by the shears of the Schnabelperchten, and the creature had reached both hands into the dead man's torso and now slid intestines out from his steaming insides, hand over hand, arranging them around the body with a kind of artistry. Ugh! The Schnabelperchten, disemboweling the man on the floor, kept working, but the one on the bed had frozen in the midst of cutting, disrupted by Bern's scream. Shears in hand, it turned its eyeless, mouthless beak toward them, and Freddy could feel the weight of its regard, knew that despite the lack of eyes, the creature studied them. The dead woman's hand lolled to one side. Perhaps she had not quite been dead, But now her sightless eyes seemed to gaze at the two men in her bedroom doorway as if accusing them, as if asking why they had not stopped this, why they did not step in even now to prevent the further evisceration and desecration that would unfold here. Freddy held his breath, telling himself that none of this was his fault. These people had comforts that had been beyond his grasp for years. They had heat and running water and a roof over their heads. They had quiet nights in which they could pretend the rest of the world did not exist. They had food to eat, and they'd had each other. He told himself they must not be from Salzburg, or they were jaded young people who did not believe in the old stories. He told himself perhaps they had been unpleasant people whose neighbors and friends did not care for them enough to warn them, to teach them the importance of having a tidy home. Freddy, Bern whispered, his voice cracking. The hooded Schnabelperchten tilted its head, its focus more intent. Chee, 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 it whispered, no mouth. Freddy backed away from the bedroom door, tugging Bern with him. The moment they began to retreat, the Schnabelperchten on the bed returned to gutting the woman, no longer interested in the witnesses. Hauling Bern behind him by the wrist, Freddy bustled down the stairs and out the front door. It clacked shut behind them, the noise like a whip crack in the night. The snow fell thicker and heavier now, and the creatures on the street moved like ghosts, their soft chee, chee, chee carried on the wind. Instinct sent Freddy down a side street. A Schnabelperchten emerged alone from a doorway, gore dripping thick and red from its shears. Its beak did not turn toward them, but it paused and stood in statuesque silence as they passed. Where are we going? Bern whispered, voice cracking. My spot, Freddy said, as if it were the stupidest question in the world. Bern twisted his wrist free and stopped, there in the quiet of Epiphany night. Too exposed. We need to hide. For the first time, Freddy saw the tears in his eyes, the wetness of his cheeks, red from the cold. He wanted to tell Bern they had nothing to worry about. They had no homes, and therefore were in no danger. But he had not liked the way the creature inside the second house had noticed them, looked at them, if it could be said to look at anything. Where then? Bern wiped at his tears. He hesitated a moment as if making a decision, then waved for Freddy to follow. With Bern leading the way, they jogged along the street, then through a side alley, alongside an old stone wall, then behind an ugly, no-frills hotel. Through a gap in the fence behind the hotel, they emerged in the lot of a used car dealership and auto body shop. The pavement had cracks everywhere, weeds growing up between them. Freddy looked back through the gap in the fence and felt a ripple of relief. There was no sign of the Schnabelperchten. I think we're okay, he said. This way, Bern replied. He led Freddy to the other side of the car lot. There were junkers back here, probably only used for parts. Bern brought him to an ugly gray auto union station wagon from the late 1950s, tucked between the shells of cars in even worse condition. Rusted and dented, the windshield covered in snow, the wagon was otherwise intact. The tires sagged like an old man's belly. Bern opened the driver's door, head low, and gestured for Freddy to get in on the passenger side. Aside from the wagon's rear hatch, those were the only two doors. Freddy glanced around, but he realized this wasn't the sort of place that would have a security guard. There were no brand new vehicles here. Inside the car, he tried to close the door as quietly as possible, gritting his teeth as the rusty squeal of its hinges. Bern shut the door, and then they were out of the wind and the snow. From inside, Freddy could see the windshield was spider-webbed with cracks and covered in grime under the coating of falling snow. It was certainly cold in the car, but better than being outdoors tonight. The owner of the shop knows I sleep here, Bern said, his voice dull and hollow, as if all the life had been drained out of him. We can hide until morning. Those things will be gone by morning, right? Freddy nodded. It surprised him that Bern had brought him to this shelter. They had known each other for long enough that Freddy thought of Bern as his friend. But if the owner of the car lot really didn't mind Bern sleeping in this dead, rusty car, it was a secret he had taken a risk in sharing. If Freddy told others, soon there might be a dozen people trying to sleep in these cars, and surely that would lead the owner to having a change of heart. Thank you, Freddy said. Bern understood. I'm trusting you. I know. That was it. Freddy thought Bern would want to talk about what they had seen, but Bern only shivered and then climbed over the seat into the back of the wagon. There were blankets back there, dirty and musty, but warm. Freddy watched as his friend began to dig himself into a kind of nest of blankets and clothing. There were empty bottles and crushed cardboard boxes, and a squat wooden crate that seemed to be Bern's pantry, with a box of crackers, a jar of some sort of spread, and other things impossible to make out in the dark. In the front seat with Freddy were half a dozen dog-eared books and the debris of food cartons. It wasn't much, but it was so much better than Freddy's spot. Safer, drier, warmer. He found his envy simmering and forced it away. If he played his cards right and Bern really trusted him, maybe he could find a junker back here with intact windows and set up a similar berth without pissing off the car lot's owner. Wordlessly, he promised himself he would do nothing to jeopardize Bern's good luck. You have a spare blanket? He asked. Bern looked at him. With obvious reluctance, he peeled off one of his own blankets and pushed it over the seat back. Freddy knew words were not sufficient, so he tried to put the depth of his gratitude in his eyes and the nod of his head, and then he swaddled himself as best he could and lay down across the front seat. He was sure adrenaline would keep him awake, that he would see the Schnabelperchten when he closed his eyes and be unable to sleep, but in the midst of such worries, he drifted off. And woke to someone screaming his name. A hand gripped his shoulder, shook him hard. Freddy twisted around in the seat and looked up to see wide eyes and a face etched with terror. Bern loomed over him from the back of the wagon, pointing, shouting. Freddy finally got it, the words making sense. Start the car! Bern screamed at him. Start the car! The words didn't make sense. The veil of sleep had finally been stripped away, and Freddy knew where they were, in that stretch of junked cars at the back of the parking lot. How was he supposed to start this car? Get the keys, Freddy! Onto the floor mat! Bern started to drag himself over the seat. Freddy grabbed his wrists and sat up, pushing him back. Christ, Bern! Calm down. You've had a nightmare, that's all. Bern tore his right hand free and punched him in the face, screamed, spittle flying. Get the fucking keys! Angry, Freddy nearly hit him back, but he still had Bern's blanket wrapped halfway around him, and that reminded him that his friend had been hospitable enough to trust him with his secret spot to get him warm and out of the snow. Bern ripped his other hand free, but now he stared at Freddy from behind the front seat with pleading eyes. Freddy! They are here! He saw movement to his left. A dusting of snow clung to the passenger side window, but Freddy could see a figure just beyond the glass, and when he went still, trying to tell himself it was just some security guard, he heard the sound. Chee, chee, chee. The bone-white beak, gray against the snow, leaned forward to peer eyelessly into the car. The creature tapped its bloody shears against the window, as if asking him to unlock the door. This time, Bern whispered, The keys are under the mat, Freddy. Start the car. Freddy stared at the Schnabelperchten. It tilted its head, just as it had back in that house while it cut open the woman on the bed. He wondered if this might be the same one, but it didn't matter. Another rapped at the glass of the hatch at the back of the station wagon. Freddy whipped his head around and could see the shadows of others beyond the snowy windows. They should not have been here. He had followed them in previous years, and they had always treated him as invisible. Why would they follow him and Bern tonight? Why pay any attention to them at all? Freddy, please, Bern said, weeping in terror. Then it struck him. The keys under the mat. He turned to stare at his terrified friend. This is your car. You live in your car. Bern smashed his hands against the back of the seat and screamed at him to get the keys. This time Freddy acted. Shoved his hand under the mat, dug around, found the keys, chose the correct one for the ignition the first time out, jammed it home, twisted it, and the engine growled, trying to turn over. He wondered how often Bern started the car to keep the engine from becoming a block of useless metal, and guessed the answer was not often enough. But still he tried. He let it rest, counted to 3, turned the key again. The engine choked and snarled and tried its best, and Freddy let it rest again. "You live in it," he said mostly to himself. He glanced around at the debris of meals, of life, a dirty blanket, some dog-eared books, takeaway boxes stealthily donated by restaurant staff at the end of a night. Bern lived in his car. It was his home, and it was an utter mess. The rear hatch of the station wagon clicked and opened, letting in a gust of frigid air and a swirl of snow. It opened as if it had never been locked at all, just like the doors of each of the homes the Schnabelperchten had visited. Freddy glanced in the rearview mirror as Bern screamed a different sort of scream. This one held as much sorrow as it did fear. One of the Schnabelperchten bent and thrust his arms and beak into the back of the wagon, grabbed Bern by the legs. "Chee, chee, chee," it said. Bern screamed and reached out, shrieked Freddy's name. "Freddy!" cried for help. "Help!" And in the moment before the thing dragged him out into the snow, perhaps Freddy could have caught his arms in time and given the Schnabelperchten a fight, but instead he turned the key to the ignition again. Coughing, growling, not starting. Freddy began to cry. Out the window on his side of the car, another of the things leaned in close to peer at him through the snowy glass. On the passenger side, the first one he'd seen grew impatient and simply opened the door, the lock notwithstanding. Freddy turned the key. The engine roared to life. The Schnabelperchten at the passenger door bent its head and reached across the seat toward him. Chee, chee, chee. Freddy ratcheted the gear shift into drive and hit the gas. The car hitched once and then surged from its place amongst the junkers. The creature inside the car snagged his jacket, but then the open passenger door struck the rusted shell of an old Volkswagen. The door slammed on the Schnabelperchten. Its cloak caught on the rusted, twisted bumper of that Volkswagen, and the Schnabelperchten clawed at the front seat of Bern's car before it was dragged from the vehicle. With the passenger door still hanging open, Freddy could hear Bern back amongst the junkers, screaming in the snow. He did not glance in the rearview mirror or try to look over his shoulder. The hatch at the back of the station wagon remained open, and he might have seen what they were doing to his friend, might have seen those shears employed in their gory work. Hands locked on the steering wheel, he drove through the snowy parking lot. The tires were so low they were nearly flat, and he didn't know what that might mean or how far he could get in this weather on those tires, so he drove. He clicked on the windshield wipers to scrape snow off the cracked windshield. They worked, but poorly, and not well enough to keep him from smashing into the front end of a used Mercedes, proudly on display near the front end of the used car lot. The Mercedes banged aside, and Freddy kept going, shaken, headed for the front gate. The impact shattered the windshield. Splinters of glass showered around him as he raised one arm to shield his eyes. When he lowered that arm, face dotted with little specks of blood and glass, he was stunned to find the car still moving. His foot had come off the gas, and now he floored it again, twisting the steering wheel, heading for the river. He needed to get away from Salzburg, away from the Schnabelperchten, but as he drove he saw them in the falling snow. They emerged from row houses and apartment buildings, some of them watching him go in silence, their heads swiveling to follow as he passed. The car had been Bern's home. Did they consider it his now? Bern was dead, and the car was in his possession. What were the rules? Did they need to kill him because of what he had seen, or simply out of spite? Would they let him go? The engine coughed. Go, go, go! He wondered how far the car would get him, how much gas might be in the tank. If he could put the river between himself and this group, he thought he could escape the city before they caught him. How far would he have to go before he was beyond their reach? One of the headlights had shattered when he'd hit the Mercedes. The other was weak. Snow and wind buffeted him through the broken windshield, but he saw 3 Schnabelperchten in the street as he approached one of the bridges across the river Salzburg. What bridge was this? The Ledner, maybe? In the snow it was hard to tell. And were the Were there figures drifting across the bridge in the snow, dark-robed creatures with bone-white beaks? Freddy thought there were. The engine coughed again. Cough, cough, cough. The car isn't mine. He wanted to scream through the broken windshield. I don't own it. I never sheltered in it. His only home was the city itself. Not only the city, but all of Austria. His home was the sky and the ground below. His home was the whole of the world. The world might be anything but tidy. It might be insane and brutal and unforgiving, with all the mess and ruin the human race produced, but he could not be to blame for that. He refused. The people responsible for the mess of the world had never done anything but take from him. Freddy turned toward the river. The old car jumped the curb. The impact would have blown those half-flattened tires, but the snow provided a cushion. He popped open the driver's door. Its rusty hinges shrieked. He took his foot off the gas and let the car roll down the embankment. Freddy hurled himself from the car, hit the snow, and tumbled 20 feet. Heart thrumming, he struggled to rise to his feet, but once up he managed to remain standing. The old rusted dented auto union wagon plunged into the river, bobbed for a few seconds, and then the river poured through the broken windshield, and the car began to drown. Bern's belongings, his blankets, clothes, and cast-off debris of his life and home floated up around the car and were quickly swept away by the river. Chee, chee, chee. Freddy whipped around and saw them through the snow, 3 of them coming along the embankment toward him from where they had been standing in the road near the foot of the bridge. He faced them, cold and tired and bruised, not sure where he could run. Chee, chee, chee. Too tired, in fact, to run. Angry, he walked toward them. Off to his left, the car vanished beneath the icy current of the river. "It's not my mess," he said, staring at the one in the middle. They kept walking, passing around him as if he weren't there at all. He turned to watch them go. Back on the street, they split up, angling towards homes along the road where they would leave coins for those whose homes were tidy in preparation for the new year, and where they would make a deadly ruin of those who could not be bothered to care about the state of their homes and their lives. From a distance, he heard the sound again, carried on the wind. Chee, chee, chee. Freddy raised a trembling hand to cover his mouth, to muffle the sound of his sobbing. Then he began the long, cold trudge back to his spot. He had to get the hell out of the city, as far away as possible, but not tonight. Tonight, he was tired and sad and broken, like the world. Tomorrow, he would start over, and one day he would be glad and warm and joyful again. He wished he could have said the same for Bern and for the world. It was too late for Bern. For the world, he could not be sure. After all, he was just one man without a home or a family. What did he know? The end. Oh, that was a good one. What did you think of that one, my friends? Spooky, supernatural, eerie. I loved it. A little inspiration for you to perhaps tidy up your home. I certainly wouldn't pass the test. I mean, if they're inspecting the dust on things, my guff, you know. All I'm saying is, it's never a bad idea to do a good cleansing of the home, especially around New Year, so you can start your new year in a fresh space. So hopefully that inspires you to do a little tidying up and get your new year started off right. With that in mind, I hope that you all have a happy and safe New Year's Eve. And moving into the new year, you remember that you have come a very long way just by being here. And so if you didn't accomplish everything that you hoped to accomplish, that's okay. And even though it feels like a lot of pressure starting the new year to make goals and everything, you know, it really is just a moment in time for us to take some time to reflect on what we've done and to give ourselves something to look forward to. So don't put too much pressure on yourself, right? We're all just here doing the best we can, living in our lives, trying to be human and not hurt other people. So Um, it was a long one. I'm going to let you go. It's a little love. I love you. Peace in your life and stay spooky. Mwah. Ciao, my friends. Ciao for now.